Hello, welcome to Sorry, Is This Boring?
I'm Natalie
I'm Marika.
for our second installment of Pride Month films. We will be talking about The Doom Generation by Greg Araki.
Huzzah!
Insert post-punk.
So this film came out in 1995. It is Greg Araki's heterosexual road movie, as it's known to many. And it follows young lovers Amy Blue and Jordan White as they hit the road and they recruit another companion in Xavier Red as they all explore their sexuality across the beds of the most visually stimulating motel rooms you've ever seen.
And the kookiest quickie marts.
Yeah. So some fun facts about the film. So this is the second film of the Teenage Apocalypse series. It premiered in Sundance. So this film was shot in January of 1994 in Los Angeles. And unlike the last film, which was sort of shot over months and weeks on weekends and stuff, this film was shot in like a 28-day set, much more like a regular film. And it also had a budget this time of $800,000, and he got a full crew, which is like a big step up from his first film. It's also shot on 35 millimeter,
Yeah.
which is another big step up.
Just it being able to be inside places instead of only outside.
Yeah, and the fact that they could build places.
Yeah.
I have a quote from Greg Araki. He said, "There's a thing in Hollywood that if the name of your film is kind of ominous, like chaos or disaster, then shit always happens. So you're calling the gods to bring it when you call it Doom Generation." Although, like, he says he, like, adapted really well to, like, the new big budget style of filmmaking, there was, like, a lot of hiccups. For example, so the first day's photography was all completely ruined by a lab accident. And then the second day of filming was the Northridge earthquake.
Wait, what's a lab accident?
Like the film processing lab.
Oh, like it got destroyed?
Got destroyed.
Oh my
in
god.
an accident at the lab.
That's like my worst
That was
nightmare.
like the whole, so they lost the whole first day of filming. And then on the second day was the Northridge earthquake attack. Yeah, I was reading an interview with James Duvall. He said there was the massive Northridge earthquake. So there was this sense of impending doom that hung over us, especially in the car. We were shooting in the canyons, and every time there was an aftershock, rocks and boulders would fall down. And because the car was so large and the trailer hitch was just a normal one, they couldn't open the door, so they'd be like trapped in the car. And they would just like see dust rising. And then someone would be like, "You're going to be fine, don't worry." So there was two art directors on this film, Michael Krantz and Therese Deprez, that worked together. And I was reading in an interview with them, they were talking about shooting the drive-through scene, and they didn't have a stunt driver. Let me read the quote from Michael Krantz. He says, "We didn't have a stunt driver, so I did a lot of the driving myself. And I remember driving for a scene where they go to the Carno Burger, the drive-through, and Amy was in the driver's seat, and she yells something out of the front of the car, and she's sitting up on my lap, and I'm leaning out of the car, and she couldn't reach the pedals."
Sounds fucking scary.
Yeah, he says, "I mean, we broke every rule conceivable. It was a non-union job, so we didn't really have to play by a lot of safety rules, even though we should have." But we just did what we had to do, which I thought was amazing. But yeah, the art direction in this film is like one of the biggest things I think, like, shows just like the, you know, the luxury of having the money. And in this interview with the art director Michael Krantz, he like talks about like the drive-through, like he says that Therese sculpted like the big dinosaur head out of foam herself, and in designing like the checkered motel room, he says that it wasn't something that was in the script, but it was something that Greg wanted, and he was just like, "Yeah, I want everything checkered." And so like they found some things like towels in the ashtray, but then they just had to like paint this like studio space like themselves. So like mapped out the grid and they like painted it all themselves. And he says that it took like 2 people or like 3 or 4 people like a few weeks. It was like very labor intensive.
Yeah.
To like paint this motel room. And he says the red room, they painted again red with like just a couple of layers of house paint, but it like still wasn't red enough. And he like said that he wanted to be like as red as his Marlboro Reds. And so they just like kept painting it, and eventually they brought in somebody with like a spray gun to like try and help them like get everything to be really red. And he even said that some of the billboards they made themselves too. He said that for one of them they like just snuck onto an existing billboard and like stuck up a sign. It was like one that was low enough they could climb up without getting permission. They just like stuck up their sign to get the shot.
That's amazing.
Just pretty cool. So I love that it was just like, even though he was like able to have a full crew, there's like all these like guerrilla aspects of the filmmaking, which are still the same. We mentioned in the last episode that Gregor Rocky like was inspired to write this film from working on Totally Fucked Up, and he like wrote this role for James Duvall. And apparently, like, I was reading how he like cast Rose McGowan, who had like only had like a small part in a Pauly Shore movie at this point, and he just like saw her like outside of a gym and like wanted to cast her. She was just like hanging out, and actually it was really interesting. She says that the reason she took the role is that she just needed money for rent. She says, I was very mercenary. And she said that she had been like homeless when she was 13 years old, and she knew she did not want to be homeless again. And it was something more to be gotten through and do it well. But actually, she learned so much. And obviously, she's gone into filmmaking. Yeah, she did a lot of films after this. Another interesting thing about this film is that like it premiered at Sundance, but then it was bought by Samuel Goldwyn Company, and which was like quite an interesting pairing. I have a quote from Gregor Rocky. He says, when Goldwyn first bought the film, I thought it was the oddest marriage I've ever heard of. In a way, though, it's actually been a good marriage because Goldwyn brings a certain prestige to their releases, that art film reputation that precedes them. So their films are taken seriously. It's also beneficial to Goldwyn that the Doom allows them to say to the world, fuck you, we aren't stuck in the crypt of movies peopled by actors with British accents. But the real problem that I can foresee is that Goldwyn may not be familiar with the audience the film should be marketed to. Something that was interesting, like Rose McGowan said that like every single screening of the film, like early on, like somebody walked out. And whenever they would do sort of like, press screenings versus like screenings to the public, like people would just be like silent. Like for example, the part where he like licks the cum off of his arm, but then like with an audience, people are just like, they're like clapping and cheering and laughing and stuff, Mm-hmm. So I thought that was really interesting. And it made me think about what we were talking about earlier with Jennifer's Body, and that like this company was like trying to market this film like completely like to the wrong audience just because they like felt like they had to. Yeah. Another like interesting thing that I read about like Rose McGowan being casted, which is kind of sad, is that her boyfriend died apparently 5 weeks before filming this film. So she says like she remembers it giving her like a disaffected quality when she was on set, which really comes across in Amy. Yeah. And she says that she was like in particularly talking about like the end scene when there's like the rape and the murder and everything. She said, I can quite easily disassociate from my body and let the character take over. It comes from growing up with bad things happening to you. But for that scene, you had to let yourself feel. And she said, I was channeling ghosts and the things that wail through me. And I'd added up a few ghosts. Even by then, I had so much going on at the time that I couldn't really touch all that was happening in my life. But I was able to use what's happening in real life. And she says that she even felt a bit like a creep for using that. But like, I feel like that's just like a crazy fact to learn. That she's like, her boyfriend had died like so soon to filming, and I feel like
so much of this film is about like being in a relationship.
Yeah. And just like being like an angry girl. Like I feel like that's like a good segue into like talking about the film. It's like I feel like Amy like really like she like really drives the film, like in just like the fact that she's like literally always the one driving.
Yeah. I guess the first thing that I wanted to talk about was just kind of the same with Totally Fucked Up. It starts with a title card that says another homo film by Gregor Rocky, and with The Doom Generation, it has a title card that says a heterosexual movie by Gregor Rocky. I mean, number one, that's just definitely like a tongue-in-cheek thing that he's kind of known for, but also I think just the idea that he considers this his heterosexual movie is really interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, number one, by labeling it that, there's thousands of films that are heterosexually driven, but they're not marketed as a heterosexual film,
Yeah.
because it's like the norm. And I think that's really funny in a way. But
Yeah.
I also read this one article from it's by Evan Purcell called The Doom Generation, a Heterosexual Movie. And I'm probably gonna reference back to this a few times, but with the opening, they talk about, it being labeled that way. And he talks about how Araki's like aggressively gay previous films, like with them, it kind of seems strange for him to have his film where he gets more funding to be labeled heterosexual, but in a way it really is just that. And he says America's inherently violent heterosexuality and the repression that it creates is sort of what defines this film.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really kind of spot on. And it's a really great way to look at this film, because I feel like if you didn't know his previous films, it would seem weird to have this film be a part of our Pride Month.
Yeah.
But there's so much queer purpose to it being that way.
Yeah. Like it opens and we like meet this like couple, and then like we like go to the car and like they're like gonna have sex, and then like Jordan
It's
says,
one of my favorite parts.
Jordan goes, "Oh, I'm afraid of catching AIDS," and then Amy's like, "But we're both virgins." I feel like that scene of like the couple having sex in the car is like so many like heterosexual films, like youth films, and I feel like it was just like a really queer twist on it, just like through the dialogue,
Yeah,
and even just the fact that there's like this Jesus head, which is like on the rear view mirror. Just like that's what the scene starts on, is this close up of this Jesus head on the mirror.
And even the fact that he can't get it up and talks about being afraid of catching AIDS.
Yeah. And then isn't this the same scene where they're like talking about like he says, "I feel like a gerbil smothered in Richard Gere's butthole."
Yeah.
And then like Amy's like, "There's no place for us in this world." They're just like such outsiders, and I feel like that's just like inherently queer, like regardless of their sexuality.
Mm-hmm. And something that he kind of talks about with the idea of violence tied to heterosexuality. And right after that scene, when he talks about his fear of catching AIDS, or basically during that scene, right after he talks about that, Xavier is being attacked by a bunch of gay bashers.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems a little bit kismet in a way, it's kind of purposeful.
Yeah. I have like some clips from like interviews with Greg Araki where he talks about like the different characters that I think are quite interesting. Like in regards to Jordan, he said that Jordan, more than Amy or Xavier, embodies the purity and idealism which motivates them all. That's why he's a literal lamb of the slaughter at the end, because he personifies the kind of unselfish innocence that's doomed in a cynical world.
Totally.
And then in regards to Amy, he says, he conceived the role as a little girl who has to be tough in order to survive in a tough world. In fact, she comes across as unlikable only when she's interacting with the outside world, but when she's safe within her own car or in Jordan's arms, she's altogether different. And in regards to Xavier or X, he says, he's both an angel and a demon. Xavier has an otherworldly quality that provides the character with a sense of mystery, and although he's older and comes across as dangerous seducer, he's also vulnerable. The murders committed in his presence are less intentional than happenstance. Xavier isn't a bad influence, he just always seems to be at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think even all of the murders that he commits are in order to save the protagonists.
Yeah.
Because there's so much violence for some reason pointed at them. It does go along with the idea of it all being happenstance, but
yeah, I feel like something that like I don't really know why it's there. It's just like, like part of the reason like he has to keep murdering people like in like to save the group, like to save Amy, is that like wherever they go, people will mistake her as somebody else. Like she gets mistaken as like Sunshine and like Kitten and Bambi, and like all of these like thwarted lovers are just like they think it's her, and then they like try and kill her. And I feel like I don't like fully understand.
Yeah, I actually, that was one thing that always sort of confused me about the movie, because I thought it was really funny, but I felt like there was a purpose to it that I just wasn't getting. And actually, in this article, he does talk about it, and I think it does make a lot of sense, and it kind of connects a lot with that quote you were saying about Jordan sort of being the lamb to the slaughter. So he says that this sort of version, this sort of kitsch version of Los Angeles almost seems conjured from Jordan's queer subconscious. It's a world that's as hormonally charged as it is juvenile. His fears of catching AIDS and of his virgin girlfriend's promiscuity manifesting itself in the form of a series of confrontations with supposedly spurned lovers, each man packing a pump-action shotgun, and each woman wielding a katana. In mixing the phallic with the patriotic and the satanic with the schlocky, Araki creates an aesthetic that can't be divorced from its teen characters. It may be a heterosexual film, but the world that it depicts is undeniably queer. And I kind of read a little bit more than I needed to, but it's sort of the idea that it is kind of all from his perspective, and so it's a little bit psychoanalytic, where it's sort of him dealing with his girlfriend's promiscuity. And even though I think one of the things I love so much about his character is that he doesn't ever try to stop her from having other lovers, because he knows that he loves her and that's all that matters.
Yeah, he's like never the villain. I mean, she's never the villain for being promiscuous.
But I think no matter what, you can always have sort of subconscious fears or just jealousy, you know, about your partner having other lovers or your partner's past in general.
Yeah.
And I think the important thing is that he doesn't act on those feelings, but it's really interesting to kind of view it in a way as all these things are just sort of manifested.
Yeah. Yeah, I liked how schlocky rhymed with a rocky.
Yeah.
Say it again.
Schlocky or rocky.
I like that. Like one thing to mention, obviously, is that this film has, for most versions, or like it's like not streaming anywhere on any platform. It's like impossible to find DVDs of it. And the version that we found was the cut version where 11 minutes are missing. We were able to find like what the content of those 11 minutes were. And there was one specifically which like really I felt like was like a big plot point in the film, and it's that when, you know, Jordan like goes off to get a yo-yo like after him, and he like gets to get food and like this light up yo-yo from the Quickie Mart after Amy and him had sex in the Chicken Motel, and he comes back and he sees Amy and X having sex, and in the cut version he just like drops his yo-yo, then like walks off into the smoke.
Or he yo-yos into the smoke.
Yo-yos into the smoke, all sad. But then the cut from that scene is like him like jacking off, and then everybody comes at the same time. Like he's like watching through the window, and he like starts to masturbate, and then everybody like finishes all together.
Yeah.
Which I feel like is it just like I feel like I imagine like seeing that would like give the whole scene a very different vibe, you know? And the other interesting thing was just that like everything cut from the R-rated version was like all the vagina jokes, like any like reference to a vagina was like pretty much cut.
Yeah, that's something that I think is really, it's just such bullshit. And I think it's something that's just totally wrong with not only Hollywood and the film industry in general, but just our society, is that, you know, talking about vaginas is somehow dirtier than talking about penises.
Yeah.
Because there's plenty of dick jokes and there's plenty of butthole jokes in here. But for some reason they felt the need to cut out any jokes that were about vaginas.
Yeah, like I've in when I was saying before how like Rose McGowan was saying how like every screening somebody walked out and she said like she thought it was hilarious. She was like, "Get with it. I thought they were really prissy and boring. It's not for a square mind, this movie, which is a pity because it could push a mind into not being square."
I mean, I totally agree with that. And I think so much of it, especially with reading the things that were cut from the version we watched, so much of it is about these young people sort of not only like discovering their sexuality and pushing the boundaries of it, which is something that can be really beautiful. And it's something that our society condemns, is the idea of experimentation.
Yeah.
Another thing we found that they cut out of the film that we viewed was Xavier talking to Jordan and sort of trying to convince him to have a three-way. And I think that's something that's really important, and it's something that I really want to get into with the idea of questioning your sexuality, being curious, and bisexuality in general. But I kind of want to go into Amy's character first because I feel like, especially with a lot of the things that we were talking about before with Jennifer's body, I think she's a character that really embodies the same sort of ideologies that a lot of people seem to condemn and criticize.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people do think that she's mean and she's a bitch, and I never thought that upon viewing this film, even the first time and not the last time. And I think it's really interesting.
I mean, I feel like also like, you know, for queer audiences as well, like I feel like I don't in this film, but like I've definitely had the experiences where like you're rooting for like queer people to get together, and like so she's like this person that's like stopping that, I guess. Like if people like even like when we were watching the film, like our friends like kept wanting to see like Xavier and Jordan like kiss, and they don't because, you know, of Amy, I guess.
I don't think that's entirely true, though. I mean, I wanted to see Xavier and Jordan kiss, but I don't think the reason that they didn't was because of Amy. I think the reason that they didn't was because of sexual repression.
Yeah.
Jordan is sort of like this character that hasn't ever really gotten the chance to question his sexuality.
Yeah.
And Xavier is somebody who sort of comes into his life for that specific purpose.
Yeah.
We both viewed this video that was talking about the marketing of Jennifer's body and just how it basically fucked up the release because it was marketed to the wrong people. It was, you know, it was supposed to be a feminist film. It was supposed to be a film for femmes, and it was marketed towards teenage boys just because Megan Fox was in it. And it's by the same director that made Juno, Diablo Cody. And when she came out with Juno, people sort of praised the dialogue as just being really witty. And then when Jennifer's Body came out, people kind of went back on it and thought that her writing was just altogether bad because everything was kind of too schlocky and witty and bitey to be in any way realistic for teenage girls. And I think there's a lot of layers to that because, number one, movies aren't reality, especially fiction films, you know? If you want people talking how they normally talk, then watch a documentary. But
and even that, documentaries are not real.
Yeah. And also, I think that there's a lot of underlying misogyny with the idea that teenage girls can't be witty. And I think Amy's character has so much bite to her. You know, she always has some sort of one-liner to say. She's always really witty. And even though, you know, the slang and everything is really purposefully over the top and a lot of it's made up by Gregor Rocky, I think there's so much purpose to, you know, her having this character who's a young girl that has to be strong, you know? And I love her because I feel like she doesn't take shit from anyone. A lot of people immediately sympathize with Xavier because he's hot.
Yeah.
And I mean, even though he is very attractive, I think the way that he comes into their lives, I think she has every right to be really pissed off and want him to fuck off.
Yeah.
For a while.
Mm-hmm.
And the only reason that I think Jordan, he wants him to stay, and because he is another sort of innocent character, you sort of sympathize with him more. But so much of the reason, I think, is backed by his queer subconscious, you know?
Yeah.
Like, I think he wants him to stay and join them as much as people watching who think he's hot want him to stay for the rest of the film, you know?
Yeah, and it's like that quote that I read from Greg Araki where he was saying that, like, she's like a little girl who, like, had to become really tough to survive, and, you know, she only feels safe when she's, like, with Jordan, and that's why she, like, resents his presence so much, because it's, like, unsafe, and it's, like, the difference between them in that, like, she's had to become tough, and Jordan, like, hasn't, you know? He's just like this innocent little being that's like never had to be tough, never had to be skeptical of people.
Yeah, and I think especially when you're with somebody who is really tough and really protective, then it doesn't really give you the ability to grow.
Yeah.
Because you just have someone that can protect you.
Yeah.
And I really like that dynamic in itself, because and I feel like that is also just from such a queer perspective, you know, to have this really tough, protective female character who's in a relationship with this really, like, sensitive, sweet, innocent male character, you know? Because I feel like there's barely times when that's explored in, like, heterosexual films made by heterosexual people. You know, it's either, like, a strong male character that likes a strong female character, or it's that sort of dynamic as a punchline. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, oh, look at that weak male character with that dykey girl, you know?
Yeah. I was reading in, like, an interview with Rose McGowan, there was, like, the interviewer asked, like, because there's, like, a story that apparently, like, her father chased, like, Greg Araki out of the cinema.
Oh my god.
And she says that, like, she told her dad not to go see it, but he did, and he was, like, she was, like, mortified, and she says, like, he didn't talk to me for, like, a year. He was so furious.
That's fucked up.
Yeah.
I feel bad for her.
I know.
I mean, I feel like I understand it to a certain extent, in the way that, like, if I was in this film, I wouldn't want either of my parents to see it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think there is also a level of misogyny to it.
I feel like I can see why Rose McGowan, like, picked for the role. So I feel like this, like, so, like, reading about, like, her at this time is, like, she was so much like Amy.
Oh, I also read this side note that apparently Amy's clear raincoat
is from American Psycho.
American Psycho.
Yeah. Was inspired by American Psycho.
I heard it inspired American Psycho, because didn't American Psycho come out in 2000?
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, it came out in 2000, which is really cool.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Amy Blue's transparent coat inspired Patrick Bateman's murder getup in American Psycho. But also, like, Amy's all the best line.
Yeah, 100%.
Eat my fuck. Anus face.
Anus face.
Oh, I was actually reading it. She said one of her favorite lines in the film that got cut was, Smith's fans always die young. Which is true.
Why did that get cut?
I don't know.
I have so many questions.
I feel like that wasn't cut for the censorship. It was just, like, cut from the edit. You know? Yeah.
Something within the Evan Purtell article that I found really interesting was when it was talking about the homoerotic subtext, he was comparing it to a lot of other films of the time. And he says that the film uses a classic lovers on the run structure but it has this sort of homoerotic subtext, the building heat between Jordan and Xavier with Amy caught in the middle, and he says that it's sort of drawing from and queering the form of the erotic thriller. And there was a lot of those at the time that had queer themes in it, like Dress to Kill, Basic Instinct, and Poison Ivy. But one thing about all of those films is they're from a distinctly straight perspective. And so a lot of times, especially with the film I've seen, Basic Instinct, a lot of the reasoning behind the queerness or the queerness in the character is either to incite arousal in the viewer or as some sort of cheap shock twist.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Doom Generation lifts the motel noir trappings but flips the sexuality, assigning the stock role of the mysterious bisexual predator to a man and not a woman. The result is a character that's much more fluid, acting as both voyeur and active participant, seducing a woman as a means to having sex with a man by proxy. And, you know, there were so many films that were similar to that, these road films, these erotic thrillers that were coming out in the mid-90s, but they're all just, like, straight.
Yeah.
Or queer only from a straight perspective.
Like, obviously, like, this film was, like, similar to, like, Natural Born Killers and stuff, but it also really reminds me of the movie Eat Tomorrow's Happy End, because it has, like, a very similar structure.
I feel like in terms of, like, discovering sexuality and exploring it, it really does. Mm-hmm. And I really do like the idea of having this character that is fully bisexual, who's a man, because number one, that's something that's rarely explored.
Yeah.
And number two, unfortunately, bisexuality is something that has been fetishized in women. And it's really sad in that way, because people who are of any kind of queer are marginalized and stigmatized.
Yeah.
But it's almost like it's only okay if it's for male pleasure.
Yeah.
And so I think to have a man in this film that's bisexual, it feels like it's not just for straight cis men to get off to, you know. It feels like it's just a queer man.
I feel like, if anything, it feels like almost like a bit the opposite. It's like for queer men to, like, fetishize, you know? Which I feel like it's cool because it's, like, so much rarer.
Yeah, and I really like that just Xavier is a character that drives the film through his pursuit of Jordan. And I feel like, you know, you can look at the film as him being a little bit predatorial, but I also feel like Jordan has an immediate attraction to him. You know, he wants him to stay with them from the beginning.
Yeah.
And so I find it really interesting that Jordan has the same desire, but it's just something that he's been unable to explore because of the violent heterosexuality of America, you know?
Yeah. But if you also, like, look at Totally Fucked Up, the first film in this trilogy, like, one thing I picked up on is just, like, predatory men is, like, a big theme, you know? And it's, like, not that they're really predators, because, like, often it would be, like, with people that are having, like, consensual sexual relationships, but it's just, like, the idea of, like, I don't know, I guess, like, the dynamics of, like, queer relationships and, like, any relationships, I guess. I could see, like, people, like, hating Amy because, like, essentially she, like, cheats on Jordan. Like, it's, like, not really, like, shown that way, but she, like, sleeps with Xavier, and even though, like, Jordan says he's, like, doesn't care, like, there's still the idea, like, of his jealousy or, like, coming to terms with it. But, like, at the same time, you know, like, Jordan is attracted to Xavier, and, like, people are totally comfortable to root for them to be together. So I feel like there's, like, an element of misogyny to that that's, like, being depicted, I guess. And that, like, it's okay for, like, men to do something, but, like, not for women. Like, she's like, I feel like she's faulted for not wanting to only be with Jordan. You know?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely depends on how you look at it, you know?
Yeah.
Like, I feel like both of us never see them as, like, doing anything wrong, like, relationship-wise. But I think it also goes along with, you know, what are societal norms, you know? It's normal to be in a strictly monogamous heterosexual relationship.
Yeah.
And through this film, they're, like, breaking these rules.
Yeah.
So I was reading this book that's also by Kylo-Patrick Hart, which wrote the book Images for a Generation Doomed that we talked about last episode.
Mm-hmm.
And this one is Queer Males in Contemporary Cinema Becoming Visible. And he's talking about the sort of role of Xavier in trying to seduce Jordan and the nuance of it. And he says that he continually plants this idea into Jordan's head through various conversations. And he even talks to Amy about what his penis looks like and how he uses it and stuff, which is definitely super queer. And I think that through a straight perspective, someone would see it as some sort of kind of jealous conversation.
Yeah.
But to me, I see it as really queer.
Yeah. He's like, that's what you want.
Yeah. And even for comparison, the film Ken Park by Larry Clark is another film that's a little bit kind of has to do with disaffected youth. And I won't get into it too much, but there's this one scene where this teenage boy is hooking up with his girlfriend's mother, and he has this conversation with her about her husband's penis. And in both of these scenes, it's these two people that are in bed together, and there's someone else in their life that they're sleeping with.
Yeah.
But in that one, it's so inherently heterosexual, you know, because he's like, oh, is my penis better than his? Is it bigger than his?
Mm-hmm.
But in this one, whereas you can read it that way, I feel like knowing what this film is, you're not going to.
Yeah.
The conversation when Jordan's in the car and he's like smoking and drinking beer, and they had found that weird kind of shed farmhouse place to stay in with the bed.
Mm-hmm.
And Xavier comes back out and he's talking with him, and he says that Jordan appears to be more comfortable with the idea of becoming intimate with Xavier after he discovers that both of them get hard-ons when they slam dance with other men.
Yeah.
But Jordan becomes self-conscious and bails before Xavier can initiate a kiss. And then that's when, like, minutes later, when Jordan is having sex with Amy and then Xavier comes in. You know, I think this conversation especially shows that Jordan has these sort of homosexual feelings that he's wrestling with and that he can't just, like, bring to his conscious, you know? But I think you can tell the whole time that he does feel a certain way.
Yeah.
I also think it's really great that when they're talking with Xavier about, because he admits that he's killed people before, and they're like, how many other people have you killed? And he was talking about it, and he was like, oh, only if they deserved it, or if they wore a uniform. And I think that's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
I think as well as with the whole idea of, you know, queering these sort of erotic thrillers and stuff, watching this film again, I kind of found it to be a little bit Tarantino-esque.
Yeah.
And I think it's really cool because I do really like Tarantino's films, and I feel like a lot of them have like really strong female characters in them, but it's also just really cool to see the same kind of over-the-top art direction of this sort of strange Americana and this violence, but have it be with queer characters. I guess like something I wanted to talk about was sort of the relevance of guns within the film.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think number one, it definitely has to do with the idea of phallic imagery, which I feel like movies with violence and gore and horror evoke.
Yeah.
But I also kind of feel like something about it is so inherently American to me.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that in all of these stores that they go to, there's somebody with a gun, and there's that one sign in, I think it's like the AM/PM that they go to. There's like the drawing of somebody, of a hand holding a gun pointed outward, and it has in quotes, "We don't call 911," as like a sign that's in a store.
Yeah.
And it seems like something that's so horribly aggressive. You know, you want people to come into your store and buy things, and you're immediately inciting fear that someone will be killed if they refuse to pay for something.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel just so American to me. I think like also just like those scenes where they're in their old these like corner stores, and they just exaggerates how much they don't fit in these places that are like, you know, peak American.
Yeah, I remember when we were on some film shoot and we had to drive into butt-fuck nowhere, and we stopped at that gas station, and there was a bunch of "Don't Tread on Me" hats.
Yeah.
And
I bought one.
But yeah, you know, it's something that's kind of, it's weird that, you know, you go to certain places and there's all of this sort of conservative ideology that's just smacking you in the face.
Because it's like not, it's like for us, it's like novel because we exist outside of it, you know. Well, I guess like for me,
I feel like for you, yeah.
For me, like I moved to America and I moved to New York City before that. I lived in America, so it's like novel because like I moved straight to Brooklyn, and Brooklyn is very different from the rest of America. So America.
Yeah. I feel like I guess that would be a good transition into the essay I wanted to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the idea of set designs and feeling like outsiders really reminded me of this essay that I read called Travels in Hyperreality by Umberto Eco.
Mm-hmm.
So within it, he sort of talks about the concept of hyperreality, and it's a little tricky to explain, so I'm going to try my best. But he uses a lot of examples, and basically he is an Italian writer, and through the way he writes it, it sounds like he's gone actually cross-country through America to write about this idea of hyperreality. And which, number one, I think is such a close connection to the film. And so he has all of these examples through his journey. It starts with the idea of holograms, and he gets into replicas, both miniature and life-size, wax figures, themed hotel rooms, castles. It's sort of this idea that in trying to create something as realistically as possible, trying to replicate something, it becomes unreal in a way. It's so real, it's unreal.
Yeah.
And it's not really about uncanniness. So I guess it's just something to say to not like confuse it, especially with the idea of wax figures. It's not the idea that it's like so lifelike, it's scary. It's like just the idea of something becoming beyond real because of certain contexts. And
like memorialization.
Yeah, I feel like maybe if I read some things it might make a little bit more sense. Well, one thing I thought was kind of interesting, that it's kind of a side note, but he starts off the essay by talking about this hologram of these two naked girls being sensual with each other. It was on display in New York by the School of Holography, so it was kind of like this exhibit, and you can kind of walk around it and stuff. And I thought that was kind of interesting, especially talking about the idea of voyeurism, which I think is number one present a lot within the film, and also just the idea of like fetishizing queer women. I thought was like a really strange way to open up this essay. There's like one thing when he talks about the Oval Office, and I think that might make a little bit more sense with what I'm talking about. Okay, constructing a full-scale model of the Oval Office using the same materials, the same colors, but with everything obviously more polished, shinier, protected against deterioration, means that for historical information to be absorbed, it has to assume the aspect of reincarnation. To speak of things that one wants to connote as real, these things must seem real. The completely real becomes identified with the completely fake. Absolute unreality is offered as real presence. The aim of the reconstructed Oval Office is to supply a sign that will then be forgotten as such. The sign aims to be the thing, to abolish the distinction of the reference, the mechanism of the replacement. Not the image of the thing, but its plaster cast, its double, in other words. Does that make like a little bit more sense?
Mm-hmm.
I found it to be really interesting. There's kind of like a lot of layers to it. The one thing I found very interesting was the fact that he is an Italian man coming to America and writing about hyperreality as sort of part of American culture, which, number one, I think is definitely very true as an American.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, thinking about like Disney World, you know, the idea that there's wax museums in like every major city, sometimes multiple. You know, we love the idea of replication, recreation, hyperreality, you know. It's totally true. But I also think it's really interesting for somebody who is a literal outsider, somebody who is foreign coming to this country, talking about this, I think is really, just really interesting. And I think it also relates a lot to my own experience with, you know, being queer and feeling like an outsider, even just in my own country. And I think that's something that this film, especially being, you know, it's supposed to be America, you know, the title has the word generation in it. The characters' last names are red, white, and blue. They go cross country. And especially to have something that's kind of about America from a queer perspective, I felt like I could understand his perspective in a way. And I feel like you can too, on like a lot of different layers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's kind of what you were talking about with the idea of, you know, these sort of conservative things, like the don't tread on me, and like even like the idea of cowboy hats and things like that. You know, all of these things that you think are like so inherently American are like really kitsch to you.
Yeah.
This is one thing that I thought was interesting that I felt like you could probably relate to, was he's saying, and so we set out on a journey, holding onto the Ariadne thread, an open sesame that will allow us to identify the object of this pilgrimage no matter what form it may assume. We can identify it through two typical slogans that pervade American advertising. The first, widely used by Coca-Cola, but also frequently as a hyperbolic formula in everyday speech, is the real thing. The second, found in print and heard on TV, is more, in the sense of extra. The announcer doesn't say, for example, the program will continue, but rather that there is more to come. In America, you don't say, give me another coffee, you ask for more coffee. You don't say that cigarette A is longer than cigarette B, but that there's more of it, more than you're used to having, more than you might want, leaving a surplus to throw away. That's prosperity.
Mm.
And I think it's really interesting because it's so true, you know, there's such a culture here of excess.
Free refill.
Yeah.
The land of free refill.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like something that when I left the country that I found to be really interesting was soft drink sizing.
Yeah, I remember coming to America and like going to like a Starbucks here for the first time. The sizes are just like redonkulously bigger here.
Yeah, there's no reason that you need a soda or a coffee in that kind of container that has that much in it.
Yeah.
But it's, you know, it's leaving a surplus to throw away.
I remember like one of my earliest memories of America is like when I was really young, I came here with my family and I was like in this ice cream store with my mom who's like very British as well. She's like a very posh British accent. And I like got an ice cream and it came like you got 2 scoops and like the second scoop was like the same. It was like that's what you got, like the small. It was like 2 scoops. And my mom was like, "Can I just get 1 scoop because like she's not gonna eat 2 scoops?" And like the woman was like, "But it's free." Like, and my mom was like, "Yeah, but we don't need the second scoop. Like she's like free. She's not gonna eat the second scoop." And she just like didn't understand that we didn't want it. Takeaway boxes. Like whenever you go to dinner, they're like, "Do you want to take that away?" That's something that's so American.
Yeah.
I feel like I've never had that. I'm sure they have that in the UK in restaurants, but I can't remember a time that I went to a restaurant in the UK and they were like, a doggy bag.
Yeah, it's because all of the portions are excessive, you know? Like, you don't get served what you actually can eat. You get served more because it's better.
Sometimes.
Things that are more expensive are worse. Yeah, and so he continues that this is the reason for this journey into hyperreality, in search of instances where the American imagination demands the real thing, and to attain it must fabricate the absolute fake. Where the boundaries between game and illusion are blurred, the art museum is contaminated by the freak show, and falsehood is enjoyed in the situation of fullness or horror vacui, which is the fear or dislike of leaving empty spaces, especially in artistic composition. So it's just the idea of more. And he even talked about the whole difference between wax museums in Europe versus wax museums in America. And he was talking about how, I think it was in LA, in one of the wax museums in LA, they have like everything. It's not like specific to where in Europe a lot of times it'll just be some historical figures, but in America it'll just be a mix of everything. So there'll be characters from movies, you know, entertainers, religious figures, historical figures, and sometimes you'll walk through a thing of Jesus with his apostles and then go straight into like Planet of the Apes, and it's just this crazy modge podge of like everything. It's all overstimulated, you know, it's all excess, it's all more.
Yeah.
He also talks about the Ripley's Museum and how they've had to create replicas of these specific unique oddities because there's multiple museums. So in a way, you know, what you're seeing is maybe an authentic replica, but it's not the authentic oddity. And so he says that the difference lies in the more casual attitude toward the problem of authenticity. The authenticity the Ripley's museums advertise is not historical but visual. Everything looks real, and therefore it is real. In any case, the fact that it seems real is real, and the thing is real even if it never existed. The sort of philosophy of these sort of replications that are like bigger and more and grander and excess is not we are giving you the reproduction so that you will want the original, but rather we are giving you the reproduction so you will no longer feel any need for the original. I guess like the last thing that I wanted to read about was they talked about the Madonna Inn. So he's basically trying to explain the Madonna Inn in the best way that he possibly can, and it's him just kind of trying a bunch of times and being like, I feel like you're not gonna get this. And one of the quotes he has is that, yeah, he says we can only venture some analogies. Let's say that Albert Speer, while leafing through a book on Gaudi, swallowed an overgenerous dose of LSD and began to build a nuptial catacomb for Liza Minnelli. It's just like super like over the top, like kitsch, opulence, glamour, excess. Yeah, he says like the Madonna Inn is the poor man's Hearst Castle. It has no artistic or philological pretensions. It appears to the savage taste for the amazing, the overstuffed, and the absolutely sumptuous at a low price. It says to its visitors, you too can have the incredible, just like a millionaire. And you know, although I feel like his perspective is like a bit pompous, I think that a lot of these ideas about hyperreality relate a lot to the film. I mean, I think on one hand, it was kind of what I was saying before, that, you know, it's kind of just like an outsider's perspective of America. You know, it's all of these sort of conservative convenience stores and excess junk food and these over-the-top kitschy motel rooms. You know what I mean? I think that there's sort of purpose to the over-the-top art direction that Gregoraki did, because it's almost like the queer, the outsider perspective of what America is. It's critical at times, and it's sort of fabulous at times, you know? And I feel like all the sort of American imagery that comes with it, even all of the, you know, there's things where he talks about how the wax museums, where they're sort of kind of tucked away in Europe on like side streets, they're like main tourist attractions in America. And there's tons of signs, there's pamphlets in hotel rooms that are telling you all to go there. And I feel like all of this idea of all of these signs that, you know, have to do with the apocalypse and the end of the world and things like violence, especially with things like guns and shoplifters will be executed and stuff. I think it all kind of has to do with setting up this hyper-real space of what queer people see America as.
Yeah.
And even at the end, when, you know, there's these Nazis that come in to attack them for thinking that they're all homosexual and laying down the American flag and putting on the national anthem to torture them and kill them. I feel like there's this weird element of hyperreality to that, because it is true, you know, there is real violence against queer people in this country, and it hasn't gone away since then, but it just being tied with American culture and to have all of that over-the-top imagery gives it a sense of hyperreality.
Yeah.
What character do you personally identify with in the film, and why?
I guess I identify with Amy the most. You know, I feel like Jordan is so, like, carefree. Amy's just, like, wild.
I feel like Jordan has worries. They're just a little bit more philosophical than physical and grounded. You know what I mean? I think he's just like more contemplative, and like Amy has to like deal with like the consequences of like the world around them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. If you could go to one location in the film, like in real life, which one would you want to go to?
That's so hard. I feel like I want to just like immediately right off the bat say like the checkered hotel room. I'm kind of a sucker for theme motels and stuff, but also I just feel like the show at the beginning, that's like Welcome to Hell, looked really fun.
Yeah.
And I also get hard-ons while slam dancing, so
I would pick the dinosaur dragon.
if you were to make the same film today, what would you add/change?
Well, I feel like if I was going to make this film, I feel like I'd probably do it more from like a female perspective, so I would probably just like change genders. But there's like not much else to change. What's your favorite piece of cinematography?
Like the one scene in the bar when they're fighting and it cuts back and forth between the Mortal Kombat game and them fighting, I really liked. And then also, at the end, when they're all in that shed, having the three-way and it's lit by the fire, like all the shots kind of fade into each other through the sort of flickering light of the fire, and I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah.
And I also just like the way that the characters move in the frames. Like everything's so choreographed.
Yeah, like they Gregoraki like didn't do like any ad libbing. It was like very strict. to this girl.
I feel like you can tell, but
Yeah.
I don't think it hurts the film in any way. I think it's really wonderful. My last question is something I talked about earlier was the idea that this film kind of queers the erotic thriller. And is there a sort of subgenre that exists that you personally would want to queer? A lot of people have compared this film to Natural Born Killers, but it's clearly like, if you want to compare it to that film, it's clearly a queer version.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any sort of film that you think you would like to see a sort of queer version, or you think would benefit from it?
Like coming of age thrillers.
Yeah.
But it should be more coming of age thrillers.
Yeah.
Like Secret Raccoons and I guess like this film is like much campier than Totally Fucked Up. Why do you think that is?
I mean, honestly, I feel like part of it has to do with the idea of it being a heterosexual film. I think it benefits from being over the top in order to keep it feeling queer still.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that it has a sort of straight across narrative that Totally Fucked Up doesn't. I think it was in the same article as the one I was talking about, where he was saying that he felt that Totally Fucked Up was kind of similar to the Act Up films in the way of like the talking heads of like the young queer people like getting this voice. And like to me, Gregor Rocky is kind of like a campier filmmaker. He has definitely a lot of things that aren't as campy, but I think there's just like something that's over the top about his work that I really like. And so I feel like for that film specifically to be more grounded, I feel like it benefited it in a way where as it's more about the voice than the sort of over the topness of a crazy narrative.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for listening.
Thank you to my one fan.
Your mom.
Yes. Thanks, Mom. See you next time, and happy Pride Month.
Happy Pride.